All right, everyone, welcome back to our next lecture presentation, where we will cover Chapter 27, which is Fluid, Electrolyte, and Acid-Base Homeostasis. Hopefully, this chapter will serve to tie up a few loose ends and re-review some very important concepts that we've covered before. My hope is that Chapter 27 will serve you to tie together many different body systems and hormones, and to help us get a broader view of the body's homeostasis in general. The urinary system, which we just covered, gave us quite a basis for this chapter. As the urinary system is in part responsible for regulating our fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balances within the body, we want to give special focus to this system to further understand how the kidneys will help us to regulate homeostasis. So the first thing that we're going to jump into are fluid compartments and fluid homeostasis. The first thing I need to describe is what a compartment is. So there are several fluid compartments that our bodies contain. We have what is known as the intracellular fluid, and we also have what's known as the extracellular fluid. But the extracellular fluid can be further separated into two other compartments, which include the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma. The interstitial fluid and the components that make up the extracellular fluid are all considered fluid compartments. They are places in the body that fluids will be contained. What we can see from this slide is that males and females will have a majority of their bodies made up of fluids. The total body mass of males includes 40% solids and 60% fluids, and the total body mass of females includes 45% solids and 55% fluids. In terms of fluid homeostasis, we're going to look at the liquid portion of the body and break it up into intracellular fluid that exists inside of the cell and extracellular fluid that exists outside of the cell. We abbreviate the intracellular fluid as ICF and the extracellular fluid as ECF. So just watch out for those abbreviations throughout this presentation. Now, the extracellular fluid can be further separated into the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma. Extracellular fluid includes all of the fluids that can be found outside of the cell. And we see this extracellular fluid between the cells, not in the bloodstream, and we see the blood plasma between the cells inside of the bloodstream. So what we need to understand is that the wall of the capillaries is what's truly going to separate out the blood plasma from the interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the majority of all of our extracellular fluid, making up about 80% of it. And the blood plasma is making up the remaining 20% of our extracellular fluid. Now, that being said, the intracellular fluid is making up 2/3 of all of our body fluids, while the extracellular fluid is simply making up 1/3. So what this indicates is that most of the fluids inside of our bodies are actually found inside of our cells, contrary to the fluid found outside of our cells. You'll see these ratios listed over here, and a further description of what the intracellular and extracellular fluid is. The cytosol inside of our cells is another word for the intracellular fluid, while the interstitial fluid is all of the fluid between our body cells, and the blood plasma is all of the fluid that our blood cells are suspended within. Just to depict the differences between these fluid compartments, you can see that the plasma membrane of our tissue cells will separate out the intracellular fluid from the interstitial fluid that's found between the cells, while at the same time, the walls of our blood vessels are going to divide the interstitial fluid in here from the blood plasma. We've studied capillaries and understand that their walls are made up of a single layer of simple squamous epithelium. This allows for certain substances to move from the blood vessels to the interstitial fluid. And we've seen this taking place in our systemic capillaries as well as our pulmonary capillaries. Very often based on pressure gradients, waters and solutes can move through the walls of capillaries. So a few terms that we should be very familiar with by now are filtration, reabsorption, diffusion, and osmosis. Diffusion is referring to simple diffusion, and that is a passive process where substances move down their concentration gradients. Osmosis is also considered a passive process, but this one works a little bit differently. To remember the concepts of osmosis, we need to think back to the beaker, whose substances are separated down the middle by a semi-permeable membrane. The semi-permeable membrane is arranged to prevent the passage of solute particles and only allow the solvent to move across the membrane. In the event that we have more solute particles on one side of that semi-permeable membrane, solvent particles will move towards the solute particles due to the osmotic pressure that is exerted by the solute. This is a process that this chapter will require a very strong understanding of. So if you're feeling rusty on osmosis, make sure you go back to chapter 3 and review this type of passive diffusion. Now, filtration and reabsorption are two other processes that we saw not only in the blood vessels when we were discussing bulk flow, but also now in the kidneys. In essence, filtration can also be described as a passive process. However, it is not driven by concentration gradients, it is driven by pressure gradients. Now, all that is true about filtration, but we also have to keep in mind that the direction of movement of substances is relevant to whether something is considered filtration or reabsorption. Substances that move out of the bloodstream are considered filtered. They move out through the process of filtration. And reabsorption refers to the inward movement of substances towards the lumen of our blood vessels. So both of these processes are passive processes, and they're both using pressure gradients. However, it is the direction of flow that's relevant to distinguish filtration from reabsorption. As we saw with the kidneys, we had glomerular filtration, and we also had tubular reabsorption. Now we know that these processes are always taking place inside of the body, but we also have to consider what other factors are influencing their prevalence. And one of the most weighted factors that we're going to see that will control the rate of these different types of movement is how many inorganic compounds, electrolytes, and solutes that we have in our fluids. Just as we saw with osmosis and tonicity, the more solutes on one side of a cell membrane will pull more fluids to that compartment and therefore increase the overall volume of that compartment as well. So the message behind the information on this slide is that solute concentrations are directly related to the location of fluids in the body. Now, when considering fluids' location inside the body, we have to consider how the body gains water and also how the body loses water. And these are two very important factors that we need to take into account in this chapter. Specifically, the body is going to gain water by ingestion of food and fluid, as well as by the synthesis of water metabolically. And the body is going to lose water through urination, defecation, exhalation, and perspiration. We're going to see these worked out here on this slide. You'll see in the bar on the left, this is referring to our body's water gain, and to the right, we'll see our body's water loss. Realistically, we need to make sure that we are gaining about as much water as we're losing. If we gain more water than our body loses, we're going to end up swelling, as that fluid is going to be retained into the body. But in the event that we are losing more water than we are gaining, that can potentially lead to dehydration. So what are the sources of water in our body, and what are our means of excretion of water in our body? So first and foremost, ingestion is going to be the biggest way that substances make their way into the body. Ingested liquid specifically is going to be our biggest fraction, but also there's quite a bit of water that enters our body from the foods that we eat as well. Together, these make up 2,300 milliliters, which is just about at our daily limit of water gain. But we also must consider the amount of water that is formed by metabolism in the body. 200 milliliters is not a negligible amount of water. It's the smallest source of water gain, however, we do need to take this into account. I'll discuss our body's metabolic water on the next slide. But first, we also want to consider how our body loses water. So first and foremost, the kidneys are going to be the prime player for water excretion. This is going to be in the form of urine formation. But lots of water can also be excreted through the skin as we sweat, and much water is actually exhaled through the lungs on a normal daily basis. The large intestine is going to be responsible for absorbing most of the water that makes it that far. However, some water is also going to be lost in the GI tract as well. So what we've got to keep in mind is that if we go outside on a very sunny day and we sweat more than we normally do, that's either going to take the amount of water loss away from one of these other compartments, or that's going to indicate that we're going to need more water through ingestion. Ultimately, we want to make sure that our water gain is equal to our body's water loss. As I mentioned just a second ago, this slide is going to talk very briefly about our metabolic water. Specifically, our level of aerobic respiration is going to determine the amount of metabolic water that's formed. We state that the specific amount of metabolic water that's formed is directly proportional to the amount of ATP produced. And the reason that we say this is because ATP formation requires oxygen, and that oxygen is used to form water from the electrons that are coming out of the electron transport chain. So we can actually calculate how much metabolic water is formed based on the amount of ATP that is produced. The higher the rate of metabolism, the higher our rate of metabolic water that is formed. So we hopefully understand by now why it's important that our water loss is equal to our water gain. But in the event that our water gain is greater than our water loss, as I mentioned, that's going to lead to edema. In the event that water loss is greater than our water gain, that's going to lead to dehydration. Now, as this chapter focuses in on homeostasis, we're going to see that our body does not enjoy being dehydrated. And that's why we're going to see a series of feedback loops that are going to be used to combat the effects of dehydration. And the first feedback loop that we're going to discuss is the thirst response. The thirst response can be triggered by many different stimuli that will all eventually stimulate the thirst center inside of the hypothalamus that makes us thirsty. Considering that the sensation of being thirsty generally motivates us to pull more water into the body, by stimulating the thirst center, that's going to lead us to increase our body water gain. So let's take a look at some of these stimuli that are eventually going to stimulate the thirst response. The first thing that we're going to see is increased blood osmolarity. And osmolarity, as I mentioned in our last chapter, is just going to refer to concentration of solutes. In the event that our solute concentrations in the blood has gone up, that's going to indicate that blood is very highly concentrated and has a lower volume of water. Osmoreceptors that are sensing osmolarity are going to recognize our high concentrations, and that's going to lead to the stimulation of the thirst center in the hypothalamus. By intaking more fluids, that's going to help to dilute the blood to decrease blood osmolarity. Similarly, decreased blood volume is also going to stimulate our thirst response. Decreased blood volume is often going to be associated with decreased blood pressure. And decreased blood volume and decreased blood pressure will lead to a decreased activity of the atrial volume receptors. These are the receptors in the atria that are regulating how much volume is inside of the atria. The lower the volume inside the atria, the lower our blood volume is going to be. If we have low blood volume, we're going to stimulate the thirst response so that we can pull more water into our body and replace the plasma concentrations that have been lost. We'll also see that decreased blood pressure is going to produce less stretch on our baroreceptors, which will stimulate the thirst response, and it's also going to lead to more renin release from the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidneys. Back in chapter 18, we saw that a decreased blood volume leads to a decreased blood pressure, and that stimulates our renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Increased renin release is going to lead to increased angiotensin II formation, and angiotensin II is also going to make us thirsty, which in fact was one of the 4 actions of angiotensin II. Lastly, dry mouth is also going to stimulate the thirst center, which will partly be brought on by lack of fluids in the saliva. Ultimately, what we can see from this feedback loop is that there are many different stimuli that are going to make us thirsty and stimulate our body's thirst response. Increased osmolarity of the blood, decreased blood volume, decreased blood pressure, and dry mouth are all going to make us thirsty to help us restore our blood volume, our blood pressure, as well as our normal blood concentration. Of course, along with this, as we take more fluids into our bodies, that's also going to relieve the mouth dryness too. Now, it's also very possible that we might ingest more fluids than our bodies actually need. And in the event that we've taken in excess body water, we're going to excrete it through urine production. We want to think back to chapter 26 when we talked about obligatory water reabsorption and facultative water reabsorption. Obligatory water reabsorption accounted for 90% of all of our body's fluid reabsorption. This was controlled by solutes such as sodium and chloride, but our other 10% was the facultative water reabsorption, which was primarily controlled by antidiuretic hormone. We must keep in mind that obligatory water reabsorption is totally determined by the amount of solutes that are reabsorbed. As water follows the solutes, wherever the solutes are, water will follow. And it is sodium and chloride that are the main solutes inside of the urine that water will be attracted to. Our body's fluid volume is very closely tied to the amount of salt loss in the urine. If we lose more salt, more water is going to be in the renal tubule and it will eventually be excreted. But if more salt is reabsorbed, more fluid is going to follow by obligatory water reabsorption. So here we're going to see the players that actually control obligatory versus facultative water reabsorption. We've already seen and heard that antidiuretic hormone is what controls facultative reabsorption at the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. This is something that we already know. However, what we have not already talked about is how angiotensin II, aldosterone, as well as atrial natriuretic peptide are going to be the main players that control the sodium and chloride ion reabsorption in the kidneys. Let's first take a look at this facultative water reabsorption, and then we're going to discuss how each of these components will also help to facilitate water reabsorption. So you can see on this slide we have another feedback loop including ADH. This is our facultative water reabsorption, that last 10% that allows for the excess fluid in our body to be released. You'll see that all of these stimuli will eventually increase the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone, and understanding that antidiuretic hormone prevents diuresis, which is urine formation, antidiuretic hormone will eventually lead to the increase in water reabsorption. So what are some of these stimuli? We see here that increased blood osmolarity will stimulate osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus to increase the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone. Just as with our last feedback loop, increased blood osmolarity is going to indicate increased concentration of solutes inside of the bloodstream. We will also see that a decreased blood volume and a decreased blood pressure will both as well increase the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone. So what you may have noticed here by now is that all three of these stimuli are going to be the exact same stimuli that stimulated the thirst response. Decreased blood volume is going to decrease the activity of the atrial volume receptors, just like as we saw with the thirst response, and decreased blood pressure is also going to lead to decreased activity of the baroreceptors. All of these exact same stimuli are going to lead to the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone also. So what I want you to understand about chapter 27 is that we are going to see many different feedback loops, but many different responses are going to be kicked off by the exact same stimuli. The whole goal of the body when we've decreased blood volume is to increase blood volume, and we can do that by increasing thirst and pulling more water into the body, but also by retaining fluids. That will also increase our blood volume. Some other factors will also play a role in the release of antidiuretic hormone. An antidiuretic hormone produced in the hypothalamus will eventually make its way down to be stored in the posterior pituitary gland, which will release it in the event that these stimuli are present. Antidiuretic hormone is going to go down to the distal convoluted tubules as well as the collecting ducts and make the nephron more permeable to water, which increases its reabsorption. By pulling more water in through the kidneys, that's going to increase our blood volume, therefore increasing blood pressure, and that's also going to dilute the very concentrated blood that stimulated this in the first place. So one thing to keep in mind here about our facultative reabsorption is that the thirst response and antidiuretic hormone itself are going to produce exactly the same effects. In terms of our obligatory water reabsorption, we also saw several chapters ago that angiotensin II is in fact a vasoconstrictor. It's also going to stimulate the thirst response, and another one of its action is to stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone. So that will be a very integral hormone in this pathway as well. In case you don't remember, the other role of angiotensin II was to stimulate the release of aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. In the event that there was a decrease in blood volume, that's going to lead to a decrease in blood pressure, which ultimately leads to renin release from the kidneys. More renin release leads to more angiotensin II, and then more angiotensin II from the adrenal cortex is going to go to the kidneys and tell them to release more aldosterone. Aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid, as it regulates mineral homeostasis. That's going to increase sodium reabsorption, and along with this, it's going to bring water by osmosis. By pulling more water in through osmosis, that extra water is going to increase the blood volume and increase the blood pressure. One other stimulus that can lead to aldosterone release is a sodium deficiency, and we saw that the exact action of aldosterone was to increase sodium reabsorption as well. So that will relieve the sodium deficiency. Our other player for obligatory water reabsorption was atrial natriuretic peptide. Atrial natriuretic peptide was released by the atria of the heart when there is additional atrial stretching. Increased blood volume leads to an increased stretch on the atria, and the more stretch the atria have, the more release of atrial natriuretic peptide there is. Atrial natriuretic peptide worked a little differently than the rest of our other chemicals. This was the lonely hormone that increased glomerular filtration rate against everything else. When atrial natriuretic peptide is released, that's going to actually lead to more sodium secretion And therefore, if more sodium is moving into the renal tubule, that's going to take more water into the renal tubule as well. This ultimately leads to a decrease in blood volume and a decrease in blood pressure. We want to remember that it was the increase in blood volume that led to ANP release in the first place. So if blood volume goes too high, we release ANP, and that's eventually going to help us to decrease blood volume and in turn decrease blood pressure too. Now once water reabsorption takes place, it's going to be pulled into the interstitial fluid. And from there, we're going to have the movement of substances between the interstitial fluid and the intracellular fluid of our body cells. Thinking back to a major concept from Anatomy and Physiology 1, the extracellular fluid is supposed to be isotonic to our body cells. Isotonic means that the concentration of our body fluids are going to be the same as the fluid that is surrounding them. So if our interstitial fluid is isotonic to our intracellular fluid, our body cells are not going to shrink and they're not going to swell. But in the event that there are changes in the concentration of the extracellular fluids, perhaps the interstitial fluid or blood plasma becomes hypo or hypertonic. That can lead to the shrinking or swelling of body cells. In the event of dehydration, our extracellular fluid is going to lose water and it's going to be more concentrated. Therefore, fluids are going to be pulled out from the inside of the cells outward, and that causes our body cells to shrink. In the event of overhydration, we're going to see just the opposite happen. And while we generally think that dehydration is the more common cause of the change in shape of our body cells, we can also get this through overhydration. And in the event that this takes place, we call that water intoxication. Water intoxication is when the extracellular fluid is hypotonic to the fluid inside of the cells. And so, if the kidneys aren't able to get rid of fluid as fast as fluid is being brought into the body, this can be a very dangerous condition. In the event of excessive blood loss, sweating, vomiting, or diarrhea, we can actually get water intoxication. But let's first discuss this in terms of intake of plain water. Bear with me and I'll come back to these conditions in just a second. In the event that intake of plain water has increased, that's going to decrease the sodium concentration of our extracellular fluid. Whether that be the plasma or the interstitial fluid, it doesn't matter. But we've taken in too much water, and therefore the fluid outside of the cells is more dilute and less concentrated than the fluid on the inside of the cells. This decreased concentration or osmolarity of the extracellular fluid leads to the osmosis of water from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid. That can lead to the swelling of our body cells and lead to many other conditions, even considering death. It is for this reason that when patients come into the hospital dehydrated, we don't start infusing pure water into their blood vessels. We'll actually use a saline solution, which is isotonic to our normal body fluids. Now, I said that I would come back here, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. In the event of excessive blood loss, sweating, vomiting, or diarrhea, what actually takes place is we're decreasing the sodium concentration of the extracellular fluid as well. If we're sweating profusely, we're getting rid of more sodium than our body is supposed to. If we have diarrhea, not enough substances are going to be absorbed by the large intestine. And in the event of excessive blood loss or vomiting, that's also going to decrease our sodium concentrations. So all of these things are going to decrease sodium concentration of the extracellular fluid. In the event that we're intaking more water, that's going to increase the water concentrations and therefore decrease the sodium concentration relative to the inside of the cell. But on the other end, we could also decrease the sodium concentration without actually increasing the volume of the extracellular fluid as well. So keeping a balanced electrolyte concentration in all of our body's fluid compartments is very, very important. So we're going to make a little transition here to discuss electrolytes in our body fluids and also to understand some of the roles that they will play in the body. As we've seen extensively by now, ions are going to be the major regulator of the osmosis of water between our fluid compartments. We've seen this very much with the kidneys and our obligatory water reabsorption. We'll also note that sodium and potassium are also ions that we'll see, and those are going to be important for setting up the electrical currents that are necessary for firing the action potential. Bicarbonate is an ion that will maintain our body's acid-base balance, and many other ions will actually serve as cofactors to ensure that enzymes are functioning at their optimal levels. So you'll see here different concentrations of different ions in different compartments in the body. You'll see the different ions listed down here with sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein anions. We're seeing these different ions shown here on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we can see their concentrations and how they normally exist in our body fluid compartments. You'll see that the yellow bar indicates the intracellular fluid, and the other two are the extracellular fluids. The blood plasma is shown in red, and the interstitial fluid is shown in blue. We're going to see each of these explained on the upcoming slides, but I will just mention that sodium can be found in very high concentration in the blood plasma as well as the interstitial fluid. This makes a lot of sense, considering that sodium is in a higher concentration on the outside of our body cells. We know this from discussing the action potential in Chapter 12. Sodium will flow down its concentration gradient towards the inside of our cells. And it was potassium that flew down its concentration gradient towards the outside of our cells. And that's why we see that potassium is in much higher concentration in the intracellular fluid than it is on the extracellular fluid. We'll see that chloride is found in high concentration in the same places that sodium was found, as sodium chloride, which is table salt, is our body's main way of capturing these ions. I'll just go ahead here and mention that bicarbonate can be found in all three of our fluid compartments, as this is one of the main components of our bicarbonate buffer system, which we will discuss very shortly. But you can see that this ion is found in each of our fluid compartments. Something very interesting is that calcium is found in very low concentration in all of our body fluid compartments. Think for a second why this might be. Thinking back to Chapter 6, calcium is actually the most abundant mineral that can be found in the body. But it is our body's bones that contain the majority of all of the calcium. Specifically, 99% of all of our body's calcium is found in the bone at any given time. So that's why we won't find a very high concentration of this ion anywhere in any of our fluid compartments. Lastly, I'm just going to touch here on the protein anions. We'll find lots of proteins found within the blood plasma and also in the intracellular fluid. There's going to be a lot of proteins in the intracellular fluid because proteins are going to be an integral player in the structure of our cells. But we also need to understand that there's many plasma proteins that can be found in the blood plasma as well. There's a much lower concentration of proteins in the interstitial fluid compared to these other two body compartments. So to elaborate on each of these electrolytes, you'll see that sodium is the most abundant cation in all of the extracellular fluid. Cations are positively charged ions, and again we did see this when discussing the action potential. This is going to be used for impulse transmission and communication from one cell to another. We're going to use sodium to depolarize muscle fibers, and that will lead to a muscle contraction. And we've also seen that sodium is going to be one of the major players in regulating fluid and electrolyte balance. This is going to help control the reabsorption of water through osmosis. And it was aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, and atrionatriuretic peptide that controlled sodium's reabsorption and sodium secretion. As sodium is normally brought into the body in the form of sodium chloride, we're also going to have chloride as the major extracellular anion in our body. Anions are negatively charged ions, and once again, it generally comes in with sodium. This will be used to form the hydrochloric acid that's found in the stomach, and it will also be used to help regulate the osmosis of water by increasing the osmotic pressure in certain compartments. Potassium exists in higher concentration on the inside of our cell. This is the most abundant cation in all of the intracellular fluid. We saw that potassium is in high concentration inside of the cell, and this will flow out of the cell in the attempt at a repolarization. So we'll also see that potassium plays a very big role in impulse conduction as well. This will also be regulated by aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid released from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. We can relate potassium to muscle contraction as well as fluid volumes as well. Now our next electrolyte that we're going to see is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate can be found in high concentration inside of the blood plasma. Bicarbonate is going to be an integral component of our bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system. Bicarbonate will bind with free hydrogen ions, and that's going to help form carbonic acid to facilitate the production of carbon dioxide and water. And we'll discuss this buffer system very shortly. In the event that our acid-base buffer system is off balance, the kidneys can actually reabsorb bicarbonate or secrete it to help bring our body's pH back to normal. We're seeing that calcium is our most abundant mineral in the body. This can be found in very high concentrations in our bones and our teeth. Calcium would be very important for muscle tone and muscle contraction as well, releasing neurotransmitters into the axon terminals and also aiding in the blood clotting cascade. Calcium is necessary to bind to troponin, and that will move tropomyosin off of the myosin binding sites on actin. This allows for muscle contraction. And we're also going to see that calcium is a necessary component in the cardiac action potential as well. Calcium's blood homeostasis is controlled by parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone is going to be released to increase blood levels of calcium, and calcitonin is going to be released to decrease blood levels of calcium. We will see very shortly that phosphate will be a very important component in the phosphate buffer system. This is also going to have its own functions, and generally we find phosphate in the body occurring as calcium phosphate salt. So interestingly enough, this is also going to have its control regulated by parathyroid hormone. I want to make sure that you guys have a very good grasp of these specific electrolytes that we can find in our various body compartments and understand their roles as we move forward to our body's acid-base balance and acid-base homeostasis.